Hello, thank you very much for coming. It's very nice to see so many people tonight, many new faces. So then, this is the second Mindset public talk, and it's good to see that numbers are increasing and it's not only in the usual suspects. So then let me just give you a very brief introduction to what is Mindset. So those who were here last month, you already know, but just briefly, Mindset is a new interdisciplinary center for environmental studies in the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. So it's a center that we started, we haven't had a proper launch, an official launch, but we have been operating for a couple of months now. And Mindset is about four main themes. First is about environment, so then it is about environmental studies, about environmental issues. I think environment is that is very relevant in many aspects of our life, but it is not, so most of us who started this thing with Mindset are environmental scientists. But actually Mindset is about interdisciplinarity, so it was about going beyond environmental science and then engaging with other disciplines, engaging with the social sciences, engaging with the engineering, with the people who produce technological tools. So that is the second corner of Mindset, trying to engage other disciplines to work on environmental issues. The third one is about going beyond academia. So then we are academics who work at the university, but our aim is not only to produce science, publish papers, and have very, kind of jargonish discussions. It's about going beyond our ivory tower and then discuss with policymakers. So both policy and mainstreaming are key components of what we want to do. And mainstreaming is what we're doing today. So this is our public talks, kind of regular event. And the last one is about kind of positive examples. We know that environmental issues tend to be reported in a negative way, so that how many problems we have. We know that many negative things, but just by reporting all these bad things happening, we're not going to go very far. And we know that humans, we are not very good at responding to fear. We flee in the short term, but not in the long term. We just give up. So then we need to find examples of success. We need to be able to indicate good ways, positive ways in which we can do a change. We know that there are many bad things happening, climate change, biodiversity loss, but how are we going to do anything different about that? So then we will try to create some of these success examples and report those examples that we find. So then today we are in the mainstreaming component of Mindset on the public talks. It's only our second public talk. Last month we had Professor Richard Collett here launching his book. Today we are very pleased and lucky to have Dr.Roman Carrasco from the National University of Singapore. I will introduce him briefly now. But before that, just remind about next month event. Will be on 17th of December, and will be Dr. Junaidi or John Payne. He's a legend in Southeast Asia. Those of you who are involved in conservation or environmental issues will know about him. He's a great speaker, so I very much encourage you to come and hear about his story about the Sumatran rhinos. It will be very worth it. So then, going to tonight's talk, we're very lucky to have Dr. Roman Carrasco Roman is from Spain. He did his PhD in the UK in the Imperial College in London on bioeconomics and environmental bioeconomics. And he moved to Singapore, where he did a postdoc working on epidemic biomodeling. I'm not sure how to frame it. He does complex models, very interesting models. And then he was appointed as assistant professor in the Department of Biological Studies, DBS. So then he has been working the last few years doing very interesting studies on these economic trade-offs. He's the head of the ecological modeling and economics. So then today he will present his work. Part of this was recently published in Science. I'm not sure if it's the same scope, but it's very interesting work on the economic trade-offs between costs and services, economic value and food production in Southeast Asian landscape, tropical forest. I saw his presentation last summer in Keynes. It was one of the best presentations we had in a very big meeting. I think some of you were there. Very inspiring. He's doing very important work. We need data. We need people who look at these things with numbers, and then rather than speculate, we can do better decisions. We can do better policy and management decisions. So then, without further ado, thank you very much, Roman. We're very lucky having you tonight. Please.
Thank you very much, Ahimsa. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I feel honored to be here with such a nice and diverse audience. And I'm also honored to be in Kuala Lumpur because my father-in-law is from Pahang, Malaysia. So I feel I have a small connection with Malaysia, even though I'm in Singapore. Okay, as Ahimsa said, my work in the last few years has been focusing on this trade-off between biodiversity conservation and the production of food. And the question is simple: can we meet future demands of food while preserving the biodiversity of especially tropical forests? So the talk will have three stages, like 3 papers that we'll present. The first one, I will show you how we have created pantropical maps of ecosystem services economic values. In the second one, I will present an analysis of the value of agriculture versus the value of ecosystem services. And the third one has to do with modeling the spread of oil palm across the globe, and trying to see whether we can think of some spatial land allocation in a way that we can accommodate this oil palm expansion to meet future demand while being sustainable. Okay, I'm going to start with the meta-analysis. Okay, why did we do the meta-analysis? I was not, actually I wanted to answer the second paper, but then to my surprise, there are no maps of economic value of ecosystem services for tropical forests. We have very patchy information from local studies, and the efforts to have larger maps, like for example using INVEST, they don't really have the connection to the beneficiaries of the service. So we don't really have the dollar values. So we need to create these maps in order to compare them to the value of agriculture and be able to say, okay, in this part of this country, it's more valuable to have a forest than to have agriculture and vice versa. So once we know the value, we can support a conservation planning, and that's key, I think, and that was a key missing piece of information. Okay, so before the studies by Costanza, the most prominent one, what they assume is that the value of ecosystem services are the same across forests, and this is not true, because it will depend whether you have people to use the service, it will depend on the hydrological system, or many other components. So what we try to do in this analysis is basically say, okay, we have snapshots, points that, and we know that the value of the ecosystem services is, let's say, $500. And then we try to see what are the context variables that come with that value. For example, what are the climatic variables? Is this place accessible? Is it elevated? What is the level of economic activity in this area? Is it a forest? What is the land use? Is it a protected area? What is the type of soil? What is the biodiversity level? And then we have also to account for potential biases in the papers. So for example, what is the evaluation method they use? what is the ecosystem services they are measuring, was it a peer-reviewed paper or not, and which year was it published. And this is the data set we had from the TEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which I believe is the best data set on ecosystem services values. And it had a relatively good coverage of the tropics. And then we, on top of that, compiled a validation data set. So in the bigger picture is that we are trying to create a model that is going to tell us what is the economic value in dollars of every point in which there is a tropical forest. And we are going to do it borrowing information from these points, these studies. And then we are going to use it to scale up and to generate a map. So how do we do that? Mostly using GIS. You need to extract the information from the spatial layers, and then we use these effects models in which we control for spatial autocorrelation. And once we have our model, we want to see whether the model is actually good. So we take out some data from the model and use the model to predict those data that haven't been used for the model, and then we get an idea of how robust is our model. So this is just to get you an idea of the ecosystem services we were dealing with in the data set, and you will see that there are very clear differences. This is the data set we use, and this is the validation data set. And for example, for some of them we have very few data points, and for others we have large differences. Like disturbance can range from 60 to 3, or you can have soil retention varying from $400 per hectare to $3 per hectare. This is a matter of concern. If you tell someone that the value of ecosystem services is the same everywhere, and then they see this data, they will not believe you, because there is such a huge variability. Why is this variability occurring in the data? This is what we were trying to answer. What are the context variables that explain this variability? Okay, so we fit the model. We did a lot of statistical gymnastics, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but these are the results. And what we found is that, and a bit disheartening for us, ecosystem services values correlate negatively with species richness. So we found that where we have high biodiversity value, we have low economic value. And this is something that we didn't expect, because the literature tend to advocate or suggest that they will be correlated. Another two things we found is that there was a non-linear relationship with the GDP, the economic activity of the place, and also with the accessibility. How far was the place from cities? So these are the relationships, and the way we interpret them is that if you are very close to a city, you have a lower value because the environment is degraded. However, if you move away from the city and the degradation is smaller, you have higher value of ecosystem services. However, if you go further, then the value starts to decrease. This is because if you are very far from the city, very few people can reach to enjoy those services. With the GDP, if you have low GDP, people might not have the resources to exploit the services as much, but with a smaller increase, they increase, and then when you have a higher GDP, it's a bit forced, there are very few points there, but the value decreases. But our interpretation is that you start relying less on forests when you are in a high income country. So once we had our model, we could use it to create maps of ecosystem services values. So if you see they vary quite a bit and they are quite heterogeneous, but for example in countries like India, red means here higher values per hectare, the values are very high of ecosystem services. Why is that? Our interpretation is that in India, the population density is very high, so the potential number of beneficiaries from something like water regulation, water filtration, flood production, climate regulation is going to be very high. So we are accruing very high dollar values per hectare. However, if you are in the middle of the Amazons, the number of beneficiaries is lower. So then you are going to have lower ecosystem services values per hectare. However, this might be a place that could be very important for biodiversity conservation. If you look in Southeast Asia, we find also a very heterogeneous environment. Like for example, Sumatra has quite high values of ecosystem services. And in Borneo, we see that the southern part has a very high value as well. So this is a big step from having a map in which everything is the same color to having different places. Then what we did is to check that our model could be scaled up to the whole tropical forest, and we did that by comparing that the distribution of the variables used in the model is related to the distribution of those values in the tropical forest. So we are not fitting to a subset of the data that is biased. So this was giving us some confidence. So yeah, our disheartening conclusion, because we all like win-win solutions, but we didn't find a win-win solution, so we find a win-lose, is that if you focus on maximizing ecosystem services values, you are going to be missing out on biodiversity conservation. So the conclusion is that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all. We need to have a multi-criteria approach. And if you want to protect biodiversity, you might need to look for alternative arguments than ecosystem services. Then, as I was explaining, there is an inverted U relationship with accessibility. And we notice that how important is to match the supply of the ecosystem service with the demand for people. This means that at the edge of the forest, the ecosystem services will be very high. This does not mean that the ecosystem services have low value inside the forest because it's inside the forest. As you change the landscape, the places of the forest that are important for people will also change. Okay. Perhaps I move through the free papers, and then if you have questions, you can tell me. I hope it's not too technical.
Some of these are general. Maybe you can introduce basic concepts. Okay, but yeah, I mean, like ecosystem services, or maybe I think most people know, but just in case that someone missed that.
Okay, yeah, that's important. I should ask you, right? Okay, are you all comfortable with the idea of ecosystem services? I mean, with the idea of land use modeling, externalities? Okay, I try to, yeah, forgive me if I am a bit obscure sometimes. That's typical of modelers. We do that so that people cannot question our things.
So should we pass the question now, or should I wait till later?
Yeah, now?
I've got a short one. Based on your map just now, could you just explain a little bit why the ecosystem services value in Malaysia would be low? I'd like to understand why it was mapped as low.
Okay, good question. So, yeah, the value is predicted by the model, and the model has biodiversity. So Malaysia has high biodiversity, so might be low. Then it depends on accessibility, and it depends on. GDP activity decreases. Yeah, so It's a high economic activity, so it's a lower ecosystem services values and high biodiversity areas.
So the economic activity is taken into account when modeling into your model?
Yeah, we use spatial explicit maps of economic activity to determine, to associate them to the value of ecosystem services.
For biodiversity, did you just use birds?
Yeah, that's a good point. We use birds, and then we use vascular plants, and we use amphibians, and the results were the same. But they are collinear, so we only could enter one into the model, but the results are consistent.
You didn't look at insects or microbes or mammals?
Didn't look. I couldn't find a global map of biodiversity for insects.
So even when you include the other, aside from birds, the amphibians and all that, the result will be the same at the end of the
Yeah,
day?
the result is consistent, the direction. But it's not as surprising that in an area that is more undisturbed and pristine, you have less people. And for you to have economic value, you need people to use the service. So that's why you get this negative correlation.
How do you value carbon storage? How do you put a price on that?
Good point. This model is not good for carbon storage, so I'm going to show you in the next paper how we estimated carbon storage. Let me move on and then we
Sorry.
take all the questions. Okay. Okay, the second one was the paper that motivated the previous paper. We wanted to know trade-offs between ecosystem services and agriculture. And yeah, the same idea. We have a tropical forest, fundamental for biodiversity. They provide ecosystem services, but we are seeing that we have very high deforestation rates. And how is it possible that if tropical forests are so important, why do we deforest them so rapidly? The problem is that most of these values are not internalized by the market, meaning that nobody's going to pay for for many of the services provided for the forest. However, if you replace the forest with some agricultural crop, you're going to get a tangible dollar value. In that sense, it is normal that we are deforesting more than perhaps we should, because we are not internalizing those ecosystem services values. So if we want to manage forests sustainably, we need to have information on all the flows of benefits and costs. And this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to put a map of returns of agriculture with a map of ecosystem services values and say, in this place it's not a good idea to deforest, or in this place it is. Okay, so far this has not been done, and this type of trade-off comparisons are limited to local case studies. Okay, so the questions are agricultural benefits greater than ecosystem services, and how do they compare through space? So we have different scenarios, and the first one will be comparing the CO2 emissions, like Catherine just asks, with the agricultural gains, and this is relevant for payment for carbon-related services like RED, and then we will compare the total ecosystem services values with agricultural gains. Because it's not that clear what are the crops that will replace the forest, and we don't have very detailed maps. We are going to use some different scenarios. The first one assumes that the existing crops in the cell map are going to be used to replace the forest. And then the second one is going to assume that the most profitable crop will replace the forest. We use two deforestation periods, 2000-2005 and 2000-2012. Okay, so this analysis is applied to 55 countries and 18 crops and cattle. The crops are chosen by the top 10 crops in terms of economic value in the tropics, and the top 10 crops in terms of area. I mean, two of them overlap in the two lists, so we get these 18 crops. Okay, how do we do this? Actually, not that complicated. Basically, what we do is to go through the cells of the map and say, okay, what crops are here? And then we do like a weighted average. We say, okay, so this is how the profile of the crops are going to be replaced in the cell. And then this equation is just saying that you're going to multiply the yield times the price that the crop might have minus the costs of the crop. So we want to know what are the net returns of the crop in each cell. The cost in this case account for labor costs, including the agricultural wages per country, fertilizer usage maps, and the transport costs of bringing the produce to the nearest market. Okay, this is the map that we created for the carbon content and the potential emissions that might occur if you deforest in different parts. This is done using carbon above ground maps and then using some allometric functions. So, okay, this is the carbon you have above ground, this is the carbon you have below ground, and then we apply two different prices of carbon. We have the market price, which is very low at the moment, around $3 per ton, and then we have the social price, the price that we should place ideally to account for the marginal costs of climate change, $25. Okay, so if you remember the idea, in the first paper we created a map of ecosystem services that we have complemented now with a map of carbon content, and we have also created a map of potential agricultural benefits. So we are going to do total ecosystem services minus agricultural services times area, and all that will be sum over across space. Okay, so this will give me an idea of whether I'm going to be gaining or losing by having forest or agricultural land. So some results. This is the map where we assume that the cash crops, the most profitable crops possible in each cell, replace forest, and is applied for those areas that were deforested from 2000 to 2012. We are doing ecosystem services values minus agricultural rents. If the colors blue means that the value of ecosystem services is greater than the value of agriculture replacing the forest. The yellows and red colors mean that the value of agriculture was greater than the ecosystem services. So if you see, it changes quite a bit by country, it's a bit small. But in the Congo basin, which is quite important for biodiversity, we have mostly net losses when converting to agriculture. However, in the southern parts of the Amazon, where we have soybean, which is very profitable, we get net gains from agriculture. But it's not happening everywhere. For example, in the Atlantic forest, there is a net losses. Mainly because the ecosystem services values there are quite high. If we look in Southeast Asia, as you can see, it's a bit heterogeneous. For Malaysia, we see that we have net gains in most cases because mostly oil palm is highly profitable, so it can outweigh the ecosystem services values. However, in Sumatra, because we are accounting for the emissions from peatland, we are going to have net losses. So perhaps one of the policy messages is that it doesn't make sense to convert peatland into oil palm because we are creating more damage than the benefits that we can get. In southern parts of Borneo, we also have big losses if we convert to agriculture. Okay, this is even smaller, sorry. So, as I was saying, we are not sure about what agriculture will replace. So these are the four scenarios. This is if we assume that we are replacing with the crops that are present in the cell. And in my opinion, this is the most realistic scenario, because when you have in a cell oil palm or rice, that's for a reason. That shows the culture of the farmers, that shows some logistic constraints that we cannot always estimate. So if you assume that the existing crop will replace, you are going to have net losses almost everywhere in the world. However, when you assume that the cash crops are going to be the ones replacing, you are going to start seeing more red and yellow areas, as I showed you just now. Okay, perhaps this is a bit more clearer when we show it by country. Countries that gain a lot from agriculture and don't lose as many ecosystem services, we have Brazil, Colombia, Malaysia, Ivory Coast, Romania. On the other range, countries that are losing a lot by conversion, we have Indonesia, Congo, Philippines, India. And this has to do with different things, population density, accessibility, economic activity, biodiversity. So obviously, even within countries, we are going to have very heterogeneous differences across the landscape. How does it look globally? So if you look at these are the 4 agricultural benefits for the 4 scenarios. This is only considering replacement by the crops that are in the cell. This is without considering the production cost for crops in the cell. These are for cash crops with production cost and cash crops without production costs. So this is not realistic. This one could be quite realistic in the future if we have agribusiness multinationals expanding across the globe. And then these are the externality value of carbon emissions at market prices. As you see, is smaller than any agricultural rents. What does this mean? This means that if you are going to pay for carbon services, you are not going to compete with agriculture in many places. However, if we were to pay at social prices, we will be able to compete with local crops. If we consider all the ecosystem services, including carbon services, we are going to be able to compete with 2 out of 4. If we consider social prices, we are going to be able to compete with the 3 agricultural replacement scenarios. If there were not production costs, then agriculture will outweigh total ecosystem services. So the conclusion of this study, to me, is that there's a large spatial heterogeneity of ecosystem services and agricultural rents. And this is good. This is good because it means that if we are strategic, we might have economic development and we might have biodiversity conservation. We just need to know how we allocate our protected areas and how we allocate our agriculture. And as I was saying, I think that's the most realistic scenario, which are replacement by local crops, and ecosystem services tend to outweigh, in that case, in agricultural value. So perhaps this is a message to say that tropical forests have a high value, so we have to bear that in mind and try to protect them. However, we need to consider all the ecosystem services and the social price of carbon if we want to compete with agriculture. If we are only consider carbon, that's not going to be sufficient to meet the opportunity costs of the farmers. And that will mean that policies like aridity are going to suffer. And perhaps the question is, we need to target payments for specific locations, not everywhere. Okay. And yeah, so the message is that tropical forests offer a lot of services. These services are not paid by anyone, so fair enough, we are going to continue deforesting. So perhaps the high-income countries have to if they have to compensate for those forests to be there. Okay. You want to do some question?
Can you just briefly explain what is REDD?
Okay, REDD is the United Nations program for the reduction of emissions for deforestation and forest degradation, and it's a permanent program to keep the forest as it is, because if not, it will be emitting CO2 to the atmosphere.
Yeah, the question I have has to do with on the agricultural side. Was there any analysis of best practices in agriculture in terms of in the marginal areas? I think that you sometimes get marginal producers moving in and you don't have best practices, so you might have more loss, variation in what your gain and what your model's showing. And the second thing is, I forgot the second, so we'll just go with that question.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question because it has many dimensions to it. The first one is they might be producing less, and in that case the model is not as good because we don't know exactly what they are, and we're using the global data sets. So we will be overestimating their production capacity. But the social aspect to it is very important because we cannot just say that forests have more value than agriculture, because to them agriculture means their main livelihood. So it would be misleading to say this area should not be agriculture, it should be forest, because we need to consider the implications for the livelihood of the people. So in that sense, that's a caveat, we cannot account for that, and yeah, that's an important limitation.
So when you're doing these changes to food agriculture, would you allow for the fact that prices of the commodities that start to come down? Because these look like very large increases in production to the global market. So if the prices are kept fixed, that will be overstating the returns.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is that whether we account for potential drops in the prices because the production will increase. And the answer is no, but perhaps we should. Perhaps not, we should. So normally what people will say is the contrary thing. They will say, do you account for increasing prices because we are going to have more people in the planet and more demand? And if you increase the prices, then the ecosystem services have a harder time to compete with agriculture. But if the opposite occurs, obviously the agriculture will look worse if there was a drop in price. And that brings us to the land sparing debate with the new varieties. So we haven't done price changes.
Two questions. The first question is, if you include the total economic value, which including the social cost of carbon, the economic value of a lot of lands outweighs even the cash crops. But the cash crops still have more return have at least are closer to the total cost as opposed to non-cash crops. So from a practical standpoint, would you, since it's impractical to tell governments if you're advising governments to not have any sort of conversion agriculture, would you at least tell them that it's somewhat better to convert to cash crops compared to non-cash crops? And the second question is, if you sort of internalize these costs, these environmental costs, then wouldn't you sort of drive up the cost of commodities because so the price of commodities would increase and then they would outweigh the environmental costs?
Okay. Well, let me go with the first one.
Okay.
So the first one was whether we should have cash crops because they are more efficient in the use of the land.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I was saying from a point of view of purely efficient use of the land, perhaps that could be the case, but then there are all these social implications. And I think perhaps what we should try to do is to get the smallholders to increase the efficiency through some agricultural extension programs. So we might get the two benefits, right? We have smallholders benefiting from a nice income, and at the same time we might have an efficient use of the land. So maybe some integration programs And actually, we are doing some research on what drives efficiency of smallholders of oil palm in Indonesia. We find some key changes could help them increase production. And the second question was about if we internalize the costs, that's going to change the...
Yeah, if you internalize the costs and you make it, so you basically make the cost more expensive. And so let's say you put a carbon tax, for example, to internalize the cost of carbon depletion on commodities. Would that have an impact of raising commodity prices? And if that's still profitable, then those commodity prices outweigh the internalized costs, and then essentially you don't have an economic argument against land conversion.
Might happen, yeah. You might internalize the externalities due to loss of ecosystem services, and still agriculture might be a better option. But it will, due to this heterogeneity, it will not be the case everywhere. So I believe if we try to correct the market as much as possible, that's always positive. So we will have a different solution, but it is closer to the optimal allocation. And then another thing is that because we can put a dollar value, doesn't mean that we can exchange it by dollars, right? That's one of the caveats. And that's the message from the biodiversity. Focus only on dollar value and you will miss out biodiversity. So then it's when the other criteria come.
I've been thinking about your inverted U model, and it seems to me that model isn't coming from the data that you showed, because you could have fit any shape to that data. You must have some prior conceptual model that you're saying, well, okay, it's based on the relationship between the people being here and the forest being there and so on. So maybe you're parameterizing the model that you've got with what data you have. But what I'm wondering is, have you got any way of validating that basic model in the first place?
The model initially didn't have a quadratic form in it. And then when we tried the quadratic, the fit improved. But as you said, that's driven by the data, which are scarce. But it was consistent with theory, so that made us keep it there. So it was what we would expect, and it had a plausible interpretation. But I agree with you, it could have changed with other data. Then we have the validation data set, and we had the cross-validation, leaving some data out, and the model was fairly robust. Not so robust with the totally new validation data set, but compared to other meta-analytic models, it was reasonable. So that gives us some confidence. This said, I will be willing to revise that when more studies can become available, because the data set is not very big. Maybe I'll move on to the third chapter. I don't know how we are doing with time. Is that okay? Okay, this is I wanted to call it the explosion of oil palm in the world, explosive or something like, but yeah, that was a bit too much. So, what are the ideas here? Oil palm has been one of the main drivers of land use change in Southeast Asia. And we are seeing that it is imminent, and we want to see something similar in Africa and Latin America. We have many of the big companies have already investments there in Liberia and other countries, and it's going to happen. And obviously we need to meet future demand for edible oil. So how can we meet future demand of edible oil? Would it be very costly if we had a environmental standard that doesn't allow oil palm into any forest in the world? Would that be feasible? That's one of the questions. The other question is, what spatial strategy strikes the balance between biodiversity and oil palm? So how do we do this? Mostly compiling maps of areas that are suitable for growing oil palm, then checking oil palm yield gaps. How much a yield gap is how much you can increase yields in an area. by improving, for example, management or varieties, what are the tropical forests, what are the different types of land use, and then the protected areas. And then we link to all that to the ranges, the habitat ranges of the 11,000 to 12,000 birds in the world. Then for future demand of oil palm, we assume that we use the UN population projections, and we assume that everybody is going to consume as the typical North American does, which is a bit extreme, but so we're trying to be conservative on whether we can really have an environmental oil palm across the world. How do we simulate oil palm? We do that by comparing the agricultural rent in each point, or less similar to what I showed in the previous chapter, and then we assume that those cells that have the highest agricultural rent will be converted first, which makes sense. You will not convert in a place that is not as good if you have a better land to have oil palm. Okay, this is a bit similar idea. We have rents, price yield, the cost of labor capital, and then we have distance to the market and transport costs. And this makes the model especially explicit. Okay, so there was a bit of a problem because we wanted to see whether we could put oil palm in grasslands, but grasslands happen to be occupied already by cows. So if you're going to put the oil palm in the grasslands, you're going to have to displace all the cattle. And so we have to estimate the opportunity cost of moving all the cows, and we did that using livestock maps, and then the carcass efficiency of the different countries, the prices, and we got an idea of what would be the impact on the cattle industry, for example, in Colombia or Brazil or for the birds, BirdLife International passed us the data of the 10,000 birds. And this is like, you have all the maps of the bird, what is the range of this bird, then we're going to project how oil palm is going to spread in the world, and then we're going to see, okay, this bird is going to have most of its habitat taken over by oil palm. So then we can get an idea of what are the birds that are most at threat. And then we link that with a species area curve. This is just a model that relates the probability of extinction of a species with the area of the habitat range and how it changes. For example, this is the Congo Basin, and then we have here these 3 birds, and then the red parts will be areas that are taken over by oil palm. So in the computer, we estimate what proportion of the habitat will be lost. We have different scenarios. The first one is business as usual. Nothing will stop oil palm, and they will convert anywhere that is economically suitable. The second one is a soft biodiversity scenario in which we don't allow oil palm to move into areas that are key for birds. The third one is a forest preservation scenario. This is a strong sustainability. Oil palm cannot cause any deforestation. The fourth one is closing yield gaps. We are going to focus on producing as much as we can in the area that has already oil palm before considering deforestation. Some results. So this is as the global oil palm demand increases, these are the costs of production. And as you see, if we are very strict in not letting oil palm move into forest, which is scenario 3, the costs are higher, which is expected because we are constraining the industry. How is the impact for livestock? Scenario 3, because it doesn't allow forests to be taken over by oil palm, it's going to push all the oil palm to the grasslands, and it's going to displace the cattle. In this case, it's not that costly, it's around $300 million a year, and we will be displacing something like 2 million cows. How does it look for the cost of unit of production. How much more do we have to pay for a Mars bar? And we try to estimate that for a certified oil palm that doesn't occupy forest land. And we see that it's going to increase by 0.0002 cents per Mars bar, so it's not that expensive to have. But check this out, it goes up, and then there is a point in which this environmentally stringent scenario cannot meet global demand, and then it switches back to a business as usual. So the thing is that we cannot maintain a very strict policy when the population increases, because we need more oil palm. In terms of the biodiversity impacts, the scenario 3 starts performing very well if we are stringent, but then it overshoots. So it backfires. We are so stringent that when we cannot meet demand, oil palm that has taken over the grasslands moves to the forest, and that creates more damage to the birds than business as usual, which was a surprise. We think whether it's an artifact of the data. Okay, these are other metrics of biodiversity, but the conclusions are the same. Scenario 3 overshoots in the end, and closing yield gaps, no surprise here, is the most efficient way to preserve the birds. This is how the results of the map look. You have to look for red. Red is newly grown oil palm, and this is for demand by 2025. By 2050, you will see that most of the oil palm in the world, we expect it to come from the Congo Basin and for some parts of the Amazon. This is the scenario in which we are a bit, we keep biodiversity areas are protected, and there is also a similar pattern, but a bit more clustered, trying to avoid endemic birds. This is the stringent scenario. Look where the oil palm is going. It's going to all these grasslands, which are orange, and around the forest. However, by 2050, we don't have enough, so we end up taking over also the Congo Basin. And this is the closing yield gaps. Brown is areas where we can produce more oil palm than we are currently producing. And by doing that in mostly Southeast Asia and the western parts of the Africa, we don't need to touch the forest almost at all. By 2050, as you see, the closing yield gaps is able to prevent expansion into forests by a large extent. So the conclusions is that there will be a point in which we cannot prevent oil palm from moving into forests because we cannot meet the demand. However, if we close yield gaps, we are going to be able to postpone that for 10-15 years. And we find that strict certification might file up to biodiversity, but this is something that needs double checking. And business as usual is not that bad because it was for the most productive areas first, and that's an efficient allocation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ron. Okay, so then we have around 30 minutes for Q&A. I think there were a number of questions already. The idea, you can tell before that we are recording the podcast, so then you can wait for the microphone. If you want to make a question, we'll do it with the microphone. It would be great if you introduce yourself and then make your question. So then maybe a few basic questions. So then I was very interested in the question was already made, why Malaysia looks so green in that map. So then the value of ecosystem services is very low. And one reason is that from this data, probably we shouldn't do only market-based decisions. We need other values beyond dollars. I mean, there are things that if we just follow a dollar-driven market decision, then we will be losing out things that maybe we don't quantify, or maybe our data is not suitable to make this very, very relevant decision right now. And one of my questions is,
does it have to do with the scale? So then some ecosystem services become very easily accessible to people who live near the forest. You know, if you need clean water, if you don't live close to the river, you don't get access to this water. But other services like climate regulation, you know, producing clean air, it's does it affect at bigger scale, and maybe the accessibility is not so important, but it's difficult to quantify in the model? Do you think that could be an issue?
Yeah, totally. The model does a very good job with climate regulation, and that's why we did the second analysis with the carbon to complement the model. And I believe Malaysia has pretty high values for carbon storage. This could also be that the studies that are in Malaysia identify low value, and they are putting it down for Malaysia. This set is a global data set, so it is underground verification and national inventories. Yeah, I think that's the danger of having this very broad scale. Ideally, they will need to be supported with local data.
Because it was very clear that the countries with bigger populations, Indonesia or Philippines, had much higher value in ecosystem services, and that's how people. And then also in the last model, so basically what you are saying is that this very stringent certification could backfire. Do you expect at such levels of demand, you know, all this population, I don't know, 9 billion, 10 billion, what was the population estimate, consuming at the American level is realistic, and that can happen by 2050?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I hope it's not realistic, right? But I guess the threats are on how to link consumption with income. We could tap on it to get an idea, and it will vary a lot by country. So yeah, it's a bit extreme. We are just trying to show whether the question is, could we meet a very extreme case of demand without touching forests? And unfortunately, we cannot. We need to allow some conversion of forests.
So is the main message that we need to also change consumption patterns and make sure that not everyone wants to consume as people are consuming the most nowadays? So,
yeah, I think that's the easiest solution. And nonetheless, we know so little of how do you change people. I was talking to Dan just now. How do you change the behavior of people? I don't know. I think maybe smartphone applications could help.
I think we need interdisciplinary teams, psychologists coming and telling how do we change people's behavior.
Well, it's a hard thing to do, of course, but so we can investigate that. That's our role.
Well, I think this is very relevant information because we're talking about one generation. You know, it's 30 years from now, and it goes very fast. And then, you know, if people don't change behavior, or if they don't change in the right direction, because probably what have happened in the last 2-3 years was changing in the more consuming direction. So then obviously there will be not much chance to conserve forest and birds, and you know, time goes very, very fast. That's interesting. So then now open to the floor. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Just wait for the microphone.
In that last map that you showed, the best case scenario, which would be to increase the yield in existing plantations. I noticed that all of Southeast Asia, all of Indonesia and Malaysia is brown, meaning the yield can be increased here. Would you say the best case scenario then is you might preserve the forest in the Congo Basin and Amazon, but does that mean eliminating all the forest areas in this part of the world? Because that's not very nice for the fauna that live here.
Okay, yeah, that's an artifact of the map, because brown means that there is oil palm in the cell, but if, for example, 1% of oil palm already makes the sand turn brown. So that's an artifact. There might still be there forest, but it just means that the tiny bit with oil palm there will get close. The gaps are closed.
Hi. In your scenario where it's land conversion to convert, what was it, grasslands into plantations? So that happens in a certain part of the world. So does that mean production goes as normal in, say, like Southeast Asia, but conversion is more active in South America, say? And so wouldn't that affect the economy of the areas that don't actually have grasslands to convert into palm oil?
Yeah, that's a good point. Probably that will reduce the number of countries that can grow oil palm. So in this case, a lot of it goes to Colombia, Peru.
Okay, so in that case, if that were the scenario in the future, how can it be governed across the palm belt? Like, how does that work? I'm not really seeing the picture there.
Yeah, you are totally right. I don't think can be governed. So this is like a hypothetical scenario. The reality will be different. The reality will be that countries will decide on. They are sovereign to decide what they will do, right? So this is imagine that we have like a global planet that says, I want oil palm here, here, here. Can we meet demand? So it's not that realistic in that sense.
Right, I think it'd be two changes I think would be interesting to try out with this model. One is rather than say assuming countries all go to the US levels of consumption, maybe using, for example, the targets in the Millennium Development Goals or something which are a lot more modest but also probably a lot more realistic in terms of demand. The second thing on the supply side, looking at the map, now, I'm not an expert in Africa, but I mean, I've got the idea of there being mass amounts of production in some of these countries, which have, I think, wars and things at the moment, also seems concerned. So it might be interesting also with lower levels of demand, also to see if assumptions about the feasibility of expanding investment in some of these countries, whether that's going to put more pressure on, say, Southeast Asia, for example, or some of the more stable parts of South America. That would also seem to be an interesting thing. It will have to provide a more realistic sort of forecast to focus on, to think about.
Yeah, about the Millennium Development Goals, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, I will consider it. Then the other one is to see whether developing in the Congo Basin is going to relieve pressure in other countries.
It's more that if political conditions are in some countries such it's not going to be feasible to make large expansions of, say, industrial agricultural production, what the effect is that going to be? So say, for example, you take the Congo out, what's that going to be the implication for Malaysia and Indonesia, for example?
Okay, yes, we can model that. We can model what happens if, which is realistic, right? Some companies might find financially risky to go to countries that might be prone to conflict, and then that's not going to relieve the pressure in other parts of the world. Which is, it's nice because we see that now everything is linked. So what you do here has an effect there, or so we live in a global village.
In your model, are you assuming that production levels per hectare are going to remain the same over the time period?
In this last one, they remain the same, with the except of the closing the gap scenario, in which they increase. Does that sound realistic?
And what about the impact of diversion from edible oil to energy use?
Oh, that one we didn't model. And I guess it's a bit more difficult to know. And there might be punctuated changes. If some country changes their strategy from into biofuels, that will have a. It was a bit difficult to get projections for that. We are not looking into biofuels.
I was wondering, will palm be able to grow in grasslands? I think that would be a little difficult. Palm trees might not necessarily grow in grasslands. So if that's the case, will your model be affected with the results you got so far? Because palm naturally doesn't grow in grasslands.
Okay, yes, we are using the IASA, International Agency of Systems Analysis. They created the maps of suitability of oil palm. So we are using maps that tell us where the oil palm is suitable to grow and what is the potential yield. I believe the yield in this, the Colombian grasslands is not as high as in. But yeah, that's a bit beyond. I'm trusting the maps are correct, but now you are making me doubt whether they got them right if they don't grow grasslands.
The point is a lot of the
I don't
forest
think
has been
they're
converted.
original grasslands. I think that's, I'm good at shouting. They're not, I don't think they were originally grasslands. There were areas which were rainforest before. They've already been cut down and converted to grassland for cattle raising. And that's why that, I don't think you need natural grassland like savanna or anything like that. You need grassland that was artificially created by cutting rainforest down in the first place. The best scenario is saying if you only grow when the forest is already cut down rather than cutting more forest down. I think that was the story. Sorry for interfering.
Yeah, could be degraded forest into grasslands. Certainly they consider them suitable for oil palm.
Near these tropical grasslands and they for cattle by cutting and burning and this artificially maintained. But if you just let the vegetation grow, it will go into the forest. So that's the
Just simply grassland.
I guess that's the current land use, but it's not the one that would be the climatic.
Sorry, I don't have a map of the suitability map. I don't have it here. We could look at it. See, Catherine and
Oh no, I was just as about forest.
The data is based on assumption that the palm plant's oil production, the oil yield per palm plant is going to remain consistent for the decades to come. What if developments were made in the plant itself to increase the oil yield? Will that make forest conservation more feasible?
well, yeah, I think that's a very exciting topic now, and I think they have pros and cons. The pros is that we are going to produce more per unit of land, and that's fantastic for conservation. The cons is that we everything is connected, right? So what is the knock-on effect? But I think that with the proper governance in place, that should be positive, and we would spare land. In fact, I don't see any other solution to feed the increasing population if we don't have better crops.
Even you publish a paper that shows that increasing productivity, what it makes is more people planting oil palm, and then what you get is you don't conserve forest, but you get is just more people producing that, a very profitable resource.
That's something we had published recently, and but it was more trying to steer debate rather than predicting. So what happens is that if you have new oil palm varieties, then oil palm competes with other crops like rapeseed or corn in temperate countries. So then the new oil palm varieties create land sparing, but this land sparing occurs in the temperate regions, which, no offense, but I think we have much more biodiversity here. So we want to conserve here, but we are attaining the effect in Canada. And in the contrary, because we are so competitive, now we want more oil palm. So we end up getting more oil palm in the tropics, which is the opposite effect of what we wanted, right? We wanted to spare, and we cannot spare. We are expanding more. And we are transferring the responsibility of producing oil palm to the tropical regions, which are the most biodiverse regions.
Rory Padfield from UTM. Just to go back to your, I think it's your second paper, and the valuation of ecosystem services. Haze is obviously a big issue at the moment, and there doesn't seem to be a reasonable or a solution in sight. I just wondered, is it possible to model the ecosystem services that are provided by those forests, those environments, let's say in Sumatra and other parts of Southeast Asia, and then connect it to the economic impact of haze? It's almost like a mini model, I guess, for Southeast Asia, as a means to show why, from the governance side of things, we need to do something more than we're currently doing. So we talked earlier about the Singapore Haze Bill, and the RSPO have got some initiatives, but if you made it stronger in terms of the protecting the ecosystems in those locations, it might help convince the policymakers.
Well, yeah, I think that would be a strong argument that when you are burning, you are creating so much damage that I don't know what are the difference in the cost of burning versus bulldozing. Maybe there is some different to the farmer, but when it comes to the future cancers that we are going to have, which is a huge burden to Malaysia, Singapore, then I think it's not worth it. So perhaps if we are able to quantify, we will be able to influence policymakers, or maybe Singapore and Malaysia should help Indonesia control the fire. So, what do you think?
So something that is not strictly about your research, but links with what Rory said and with the first papers. So that one of the implications is that ecosystem services are valued, and then someone is willing to pay for them in some way. And so it's a very complex market because of all this connectedness. So then how protecting forests in Indonesia, who should pay for that, and how much a Singaporean or someone from Malaysia or from Vietnam should pay for that, from Norway or from the UK. So then what is your gut feeling, how positive you are about all these solutions that are often discussed about payment for ecosystem services, or we talk about RED and having other suggestions. So then do you think that it's going to materialize, it's going to happen, and can really change the game? Or it's going to be always, something that is discussed in papers but doesn't happen in reality?
I'm positive. I'm optimistic because you see in RED the reduction of ecosystem of emissions, and it's happening, but it's not happening at the scale that we were expecting, which is discouraging. But at least I can see that we are more aware of the problems with ecosystem services. We were talking about the Millennium Development Goals, and the United Nations is more aware. We have information, and we have the internet. Everybody knows what's going on, and big companies now they are exposed, so it's also in their interest to perform, and they are trying to perform. We were listening about Wilmar trying to have another deforestation policy, and I see many positive things happening. So perhaps the question is, are we going to be fast enough? But I see positive steps in the right direction.
So then another two questions. One is, you're talking about the importance of like applications, or the importance of the consumer making choices. So then consumer can drive the behavior of companies. So maybe it's easier to modify the behavior of a company rather than modify the behavior of 1.5 million Chinese or units. And so then I think you're doing also some interesting work using apps, or you have some ideas about how simple things, simple tools can change our day-to-day, decision making. So when you go shopping and when you decide to do some activity against not doing it. And another question is, in your second paper, there was a big gap between the market value of carbon and social value of carbon, and how that gap can be filled in, and do you think that eventually will be a market will fill up that gap?
I think that things like Facebook or Twitter or smartphone applications can be very useful. And I was talking about this example of, actually I think it was FFI. Mr. Linky was telling me they had a change of land use plan in Aceh that was going to affect forests. And then there was an outcry, and then there was a petition in Facebook to stop the plan, and then there were thousands of signatures in a matter of days. And then they stopped the land use plan, so it's like, wow, very powerful. So I think we have to explore that more, because we can get people's reaction across the globe real time. The second question was about
the market value and the social value of carbon.
That pick up. The first one is what the carbon is being traded now, the Chicago index, and it's like so it is a purely speculative. So if they perceive that the UN is not too serious about it, then there's not much trade of carbon. That's pure speculation. The second one is theoretical, and when it comes to say, okay, we expect the cost of climate change to be this. So every extra ton of carbon contributes this marginal cost. So in theory, the social value is what we're going to suffer. The other one is what the traders perceive as. So I will run the analysis with the $25 per ton, and some studies say about $100 per ton.
But do you foresee a matching of both values becoming close to each other? What is the real cost and what is being paid in the market? I'm not very confident because it's not increasing, it's even decreasing. So I'm not very optimistic there. It's difficult to say. Maybe we change and we decide to put the actual value of things and not let the market decide how much is the carbon price. Before you're talking about letting market work, but also with some amount of regulation and not.
I have a question regarding the land use. So it's from your map, you see that we're running out of land. But you're looking at the scenario of oil palm taking over a lot of agricultural land that is suitable for agriculture. But we need to eat other food as well, not just oil palm. I mean, we have vegetables, and also these will be competing with oil palm for this prime land. So we should consider taking into account this.
I have a student doing that now, doing it for the 20 crops, and obviously only one crop and already putting so much pressure. So imagine when we put all the crops, then it will be, I don't know if we will have any forest left. If we put all the crops and we assume that demand is going to be like the North Americans.
You envision some kind of doom scenario in which protected areas are not respected and people are planting in national parks and...
Totally. I think that protected areas are already not respected, right? So, looking at satellite images in Indonesia, there is so much deforestation within protected areas of type 1, the most important for biodiversity. And then recently, I don't know if you heard about PADDD, protected area, downsizement, degazetment, and decommissioning. So there are many protected areas that they were there, they used to be there, they are not there anymore, because the government decides that they cannot afford to have a protected. So,
Okay, any final question?
Just to add on a bit, maybe it's not in the topic, but you can see that countries with very limited land, like Singapore, are making use more of the sea. maybe we should be moving to that direction, looking at using the surface area of the sea to grow our food. Just I don't think.
Okay, good. Yeah, I guess it's quite costly, but maybe it's related to geoengineering, right? So should we have solutions to big problems, big engineering solutions, maybe? And perhaps, or hydroponic crops, or we should feed ourselves with insects and algae.
That's interesting. To follow up on Ethan's comment, if you internalize the cost from your last speak, you internalize the costs of converting forest use, then maybe growing food through big engineering projects in the sea becomes profitable compared to growing on land.
Could be. Yeah, I think there was some research about using algae for biofuel. If they had a breakthrough there, then oil palm will become competitive.
In your study, is there like a number showing that what is the optimum demand for oil palm for the world? Because here you say like if it beyond 500 million ton, cannot be met without conversion of the forest. But like I think the focus is now about converting or not converting, but seems like the root cause is the demand of the world. So can we come out and say, okay, this is the optimum, you can't do more than, you can't like want more than this is the maximum number that we should just stop. So that no more conversion, stop using the seed, whatever, just like stop. Did your study show that number?
No, but yeah, perhaps, I mean, nobody wants to say this, right? But perhaps we should put a cap on how many children we can have. And then I thought, okay, this is a crazy idea. But then I was reading Harding's paper on the tragedy of the commons, and he was suggesting that in the 70s, not to have more than 2 children per family. So perhaps we should say what is the optimal number of children, or because if we say no more oil palm, then somebody will not be able to get food.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, there are ethical considerations that they are very complicated.
I think there was one country that decided something like that, right?
Only one kid.
Have you considered climate change and particularly warming? Because I know some of the forests, I know that the tropical forests in northeastern Queensland will disappear with a 5-degree increase. So if we're going to get an increase by 2050, then oil palm mightn't be growing in the places that it is now. It'll be growing in other places and maybe in more temperate regions at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't consider climate change. That's true. The distribution of the suitability will change, and the problem is that we are so bad at predicting rainfall. Temperature is okay, but how to know where the rainfall will be sufficient for a palm leaf? Things will change. Yeah.
One more question? Okay. Thank you very much, Roman. Very interesting.
Thanks everyone. It was very interesting.